in the dusty heart of the frontier, where wind carried stories farther than wagons ever could. There walked a girl who had learned too early that the world was not always gentle. She traveled alone now, clutching a small canvas bag, her boots worn thin from days of wandering. The sun hung low behind her, casting long shadows across the winding trail. Coyotes called from somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, and the river below whispered against smooth stone. She kept walking, not sure where the road would lead, only knowing she could not return to where she came from. The small settlement she once called home had turned into a place of whispered blame, harsh eyes, and quiet cruelty. People feared what they did not understand, and they feared her story most of all. She had once lived there with hope. She had believed in kindness. But after the fire that burned through the little homestead on the hill, taking away the only person she trusted, nothing felt safe anymore. Townsfolk said it was fate or punishment. Others said she brought misfortune. Men looked at her with suspicion. Women looked at her with pity. The sheriff looked at her with empty silence. The morning she left, she did not cry. She simply packed what remained and headed west, where the land was wide and the sky even wider. That was where she hoped to find a chance to begin again. Days passed, marked only by hunger and cold nights beneath patchy blankets. She fought hard to stay upright, especially when the trail cut through steep ravines and thorny brush that scraped her arms. At night she listened to the crackling fire, clinging to memories she wished would fade. She tried to sleep, though darkness always pulled old memories back to life. She could still hear screams from the night of the fire, could still smell smoke caught deep in her hair, and could still feel that awful moment when helping someone cost her everything. On the fourth night of her journey, exhaustion took her strength, and she collapsed near a riverbed. She drank from the chilled stream, but as the wind shifted, she sensed movement beyond the tree line. She held still, eyes narrowed, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves. Something or someone was nearby. The stories settlers told about tribes in these lands echoed through her mind. Some said the Apache watched their borders like hawks, moving silent as spirits. Others claimed they protected their land fiercely and took no chances with strangers. Yet rumors often carried more fear than truth. The girl stayed low, clutching a branch for defense. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall, steady, and powerful in posture. He moved as though he belonged to the wind itself. The flicker of moonlight ran along his braided dark hair, glinting off pieces of carved tribal jewelry resting across his chest. His skin, strong and weathered by sun, carried symbols inked into it like stories etched by time. He did not speak at first. He studied her quietly, dark eyes sharp yet calm, taking in her trembling hands and weary stance. She noticed he carried no firearm, only a bow and a blade carved from bone. There was strength in him, but also patience. She backed away until her boots met water. He raised his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. His voice, when it came, was steady and low, as if speaking too loudly might frighten her further. He asked why she wandered alone through dangerous country, and why she carried sadness like a weight across her shoulders. She hesitated. Trust had become a stranger to her. She answered carefully, explaining she was passing through, seeking no trouble and needing no help. But he looked past her words and saw the truth in her tired eyes. He told her these lands belonged to his people, that they watched every traveler who stepped through. He said most outsiders kept their distance out of fear. She told him she feared no one anymore. His expression changed then, not with amusement, but with understanding. He invited her to follow him to a safer place nearby, sheltered ledge beneath tall pines where she could rest without wolves creeping close. She hesitated again but followed, staying a careful distance behind. They reached a small camp lit by a slow-burning fire. The Apache had been tracking game before she arrived. A small piece of roasted meat lay on a stone, untouched. She tried not to stare at it, though hunger twisted inside her. He noticed but said nothing at first. Instead, he asked about the settlement she left. She tried to explain but stopped midway, her voice breaking. He let silence settle, giving her space. When he finally spoke, his tone softened even further, heavy with compassion rather than curiosity. He told her every soul carried scars, and every scar carried a lesson. He told her pain could shape people into stronger beings, but only if someone reminded them life still held warmth beyond sorrow. As he spoke, she felt something stir inside her. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest spark of safety. For a long time, she watched him tend the fire, his movements calm and practiced. She wondered how someone who lived in such harsh land could speak with such gentleness. When she finally ate, he looked away to give her dignity. The wind slowed. The night grew warmer. For the first time in months, she felt her body relax just enough to breathe without shaking. He turned to her then, his voice almost a whisper. Carrying more promise than any oath sworn before witnesses, he said that if she chose to stay near his people, if she chose to walk beside him instead of walking alone, he would guard her peace with everything he had. He said suffering did not have to own her life anymore. The frontier was full of danger, but it was also full of new beginnings. Then he leaned close enough for her to hear him clearly over the crackling flames. His words slow, certain, and gentle. Be with me each day, and I will make sure you never suffer again. Her breath caught. She did not know whether to believe him, whether such a vow could truly be kept in a land where loss felt as common as dust. Yet something in his eyes held a truth she had not seen in any settler town. A promise born not of possession or desire, but of protection and shared strength. Still, hope was a heavy thing to lift again. She looked at the path leading back into darkness, and then at the silent expanse beyond the firelight. She wondered what price might come with trusting him, and whether staying would lead to healing or only deeper pain. The night offered no answers, only the steady heartbeat of distant drums echoing through the trees, signaling that others of his tribe were closer than she thought. Before she could speak, the sound of horses thudding through the brush shattered the quiet. Torches flickered among shadows. Someone was coming fast, and not with peaceful intentions. The Apache stood, jaw tight, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. He positioned himself between her and the approaching riders, one hand tightening around his blade as firelight danced across muscle and scar. The girl rose slowly, heart pounding, realizing she had stepped into a world far more dangerous than the one she fled. And now she would have to choose whether to run again or stay and face whatever came next alongside the man who offered protection. The torches drew closer, voices growing louder. She realized the night was not done testing her. The torches grew brighter as the riders closed the distance, the sharp rhythm of hooves echoing across the valley. The girl stepped back, her pulse racing. She didn't know who these men were, yet the urgency in their approach felt hostile. The Apache didn't move from his place in front of her. His stance shifted, calm yet ready, like a panther waiting for the right moment to strike. The firelight caught the edge of his blade, and though he stood silent, there was a warning in his posture, strong enough to make any intruder think twice. The first rider reached the clearing, his horse snorting, kicking up dirt and pine needles. He was wrapped in a heavy coat, face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. Two others followed close behind. None carried tribal markings. Their clothing matched the frontier trade routes and old mining camps. Their eyes scanned the Apache's camp, then landed on the girl. And the leader let out a long breath that sounded more like a threat than relief. She recognized the look. It was the same measuring stare she often saw in the settlement before leaving. The look that tried to decide if she was easy to push, easy to blame, or easy to take. The leader leaned forward in his saddle and spoke with a forced ease. Saying they were tracking a stranger who left town recently under suspicion, he claimed they only wanted to speak to clear confusion. His tone dipped just enough to show he didn't care to convince anyone. The Apache stood still. The men continued circling the clearing, their horses restless. They asked what she was doing out here and why she was alone so far from town. She swallowed hard, knowing her answer mattered. Before she could speak, the Apache told them she was under his protection. The leader's jaw tightened. Protection was a word that carried weight on this land. It challenged power and drew lines. The men exchanged looks, eyes narrowing. Their horses pawed the ground. They claimed the frontier didn't belong to anyone, least of all tribal wanderers. The Apache replied something jagged yet measured. A reminder this land had belonged to his people long before the riders or their settlements existed. The tension rose like heat from the flames. No weapon had been raised, but a single wrong breath could have changed that. One of the riders leaned close to the leader and whispered something. The girl couldn't hear the words, but she could see the hunger in their eyes. It wasn't justice they sought. It was control. They turned back to her and told her she had one chance to leave with them, that things would go easier if she just returned. She shook slightly, torn between the fear that had chased her from town and the fear now staring at her from horseback. She didn't answer. The leader clicked his tongue and the horses pivoted, hooves scraping against rock. They didn't fight, not yet, but their silence said they would return. And next time they wouldn't speak first. The Apache didn't relax until the torches vanished into the distance. He watched the darkness long after the last hoofbeat faded. The girl lowered herself beside the fire again, her legs still shaking. He finally sat down, though his gaze remained on the trail. He asked why those men hunted her. She tried to explain, piecing together memories she wished she could bury. She told him about the fire that tore through the settlement, about how people looked for someone to blame when tragedy struck. She told him how kindness turned to suspicion, how whispers replaced sympathy, and how leaving felt safer than staying. She didn't give every detail. Some wounds were still fresh enough to bleed. But she spoke enough for him to understand she carried more than simple fear. She carried guilt, whether deserved or not. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stared at the flames as though they spoke back. After a long silence, he said that the world beyond his tribe had become desperate. People fought over land, cattle, gold, rumors, even pride. He said pain made people dangerous when they refused to understand it. Then he told her something she hadn't expected. He explained his own past, not in a full tale but in pieces, as though he too feared tearing open old scars. He said he once belonged to a larger band that moved with the seasons, hunting, trading, protecting their traditions. That changed when soldiers and settlers pushed deeper into the territory, claiming rivers, forests, and sacred places. Conflict grew faster than peace. Many were captured or forced away. Some fought in resistance. Others disappeared into unfamiliar land. He had been separated from some he loved, wandering to scout new territory and build a safe path for whoever remained. His pain sat differently than hers, but it lived in the quiet of his voice. The girl realized then that he wasn't offering protection simply out of pity. He understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep walking. He told her that choosing to stand with someone meant more than sharing shelter. It meant sharing burdens. The idea frightened her, yet something inside her softened again. Like a seed finally finding water after a long drought, they rested little that night. The Apache stayed awake, watching the forest, listening to distant calls. When dawn broke, smoke from a distant camp drifted across the horizon. He said they could not remain there. She followed him up a ridge that led deeper into tribal territory. Passing through thick sagebrush and stone formations carved by wind, every step carried uncertainty, but the land around them felt more alive. Birds circled high overhead, calling out to each other. Wild horses moved in small herds in the valleys below. The air smelled of cedar and river clay. She noticed markings carved into stone along the path, symbols she didn't understand. When she asked about them, he explained they were signs for his people, warnings or messages for those who traveled through. She realized then that she was stepping into a world shaped by laws older than the settlement she left behind. Laws rooted in respect rather than ownership. She wondered if she even belonged here. Yet he assured her this land welcomed those who carried sincerity instead of greed. By midday, it reached a high lookout where the earth fell away in cliffs. From there she could see miles of untamed wilderness stretching into distant mountains. It made her feel small, yet strangely free. The Apache watched her as she stood at the cliff's edge, taking in the sweeping horizon. He told her she could choose her path now. She didn't need to run forever. She could build something new. But before she could answer, he pointed to dust rising far behind them. The riders from the night before were not alone this time. Additional figures rode with them, moving fast, following tracks up the ridge. He told her they needed to keep moving. She tried to breathe through the panic creeping up her spine. He guided her through narrow trails only he seemed to know. The land shifted from open rock to tall grass as they descended into a canyon hidden beneath the ridge. Hawk cries echoed above. She felt the chase close in, not just from the men behind them, but from her past, refusing to let her go. At the canyon floor, they reached the entrance of a hidden ravine where water trickled through smooth stone. The Apache paused, listening. Voices echoed faintly in the distance. The riders were getting closer, faster than she expected. He turned to her and said that she had to decide now whether she would keep running alone or trust someone willing to stand beside her. He stepped forward, steady voice low enough that only she could hear. He promised again that staying with him meant she wouldn't suffer alone. Not because he could erase her past, but because he could share the weight of it. She felt the truth in his words, but also the danger of choosing wrong so far from everything she knew. Before she could speak, the sound of rocks clattering up the ridge broke through the canyon walls. The riders were above them, silhouettes forming against the pale sky. The Apache reached for his weapon. She stepped back, pressed against cold stone, knowing this moment would change everything. The wind stilled. The canyon held its breath, waiting to see whether she would face the world by his side or fall back into the hands of those who chased her. The riders called out, demanding she show herself. The Apache looked at her, waiting for her choice, and the world around them tightened into silence. Just before the first rider raised his rifle, the rider's rifle glinted in the weak canyon light. For a breath, the world went still. The girl felt every beat of her heart, loud as a drum in her ears. Then the Apache moved. He caught her wrist and pulled her behind a jut of rock just as the rifle cracked. Stone splintered where her head had been. Dust showered her hair. She dropped low, pressing her back to the canyon wall, holding in a cry. The warrior called out to the men above, in his own language first. The words sharp and strong, then in broken frontier speech. He warned them that firing into his land would not end well. The riders shouted back that the only thing they wanted was the girl, that she was wanted in town for questioning about the fire, about a missing chest of money, about the death that followed. Their words echoed between the stone walls, growing larger than they were. The girl wanted to scream that they were lying, that she had never touched a coin of that money. But she knew lies traveled faster than truth. The Apache looked at her, eyes steady, questioning. She shook her head in a fierce small motion, the only answer she had left. He seemed to accept it. Another shot rang out, this one hitting lower, close enough that she felt its force in the rock at her side. He whispered that they had to move now. He led her along the canyon wall, keeping low, guiding her to a narrow split in the stone that she never would have noticed on her own. They squeezed through sideways, the rock scraping her shoulders. Behind them, the riders cursed, trying to follow, but their horses could not enter the tight gap. The warrior glanced back, a thin line of resolve set in his jaw, then pulled her deeper into the hidden passage. The split opened into a twisting path that wound upward, the ground slick from a ribbon of water that had carved its way through over many seasons. Light cut through from above in thin blades. They climbed in silence, both listening for any sign that the riders had found another way in. Only when they reached the top and stepped out onto a high shelf did she dare breathe fully again. From this shelf, the land stretched out in broken hills and wooded draws. He pointed toward a distant line of trees along a hidden valley. That was where his people were camped now. If they reached it, she would no longer be alone with this trouble. But she understood that meant bringing her troubles straight to his family. They started across the rough ground, moving fast but careful. As they walked, the girl's mind returned to the accusations the riders had shouted. Missing money. Blame for death. She thought back to the night of the fire. The ranch owner had kept a strongbox under the floorboards of his small office. That night, while flames climbed the walls, someone had torn the boards up. When the smoke cleared, the box was gone, and the owner was dead. People had needed someone to blame. A young girl with no kin was easy to point to. Back in town, the new merchant, the same man who had sent the riders after her, made remarks loud enough for all to hear. He claimed he saw her slipping from the office earlier that week. He told the story so many times, It turned into the only truth anyone cared to believe. No one asked why he was standing so close to the office that night, or why his hands smelled of lamp oil the next day. The girl had seen the oil on his sleeves, but her word alone had no weight. The memory weighed heavy in her thoughts as she trudged after the Apache, dust rising around her boots. Meanwhile, on the ridge behind them, the riders gathered at the edge of the canyon, angry at losing their quarry. The leader, the same merchant who had turned town gossip against the girl, glared at the split in the stone where they had vanished. He was not a rancher by birth. He had come from farther east, bringing boxes of goods and a smooth tongue, promising to turn the raw frontier settlement into a thriving place of trade. But every promise he made carried a price that others paid. The lost money meant more to him than he ever let on. It was not just a small fortune. It tied him to darker deals back east. If word spread that the money was missing and he had no one to blame, questions might start reaching places he did not want them to. So he swore to himself he would drag that girl back across town dust, even if he had to step into tribal land to do it. He also saw another use in this chase. If he could claim that the Apache had stolen and sheltered a criminal, he could stir the settlement against the tribe and push for soldiers to clear them. From the valley he wanted to claim for grazing and mining. One of the other riders, a former ranch hand who had known the girl before the fire, shifted uneasily beside him. He remembered how she helped brand calves on long hot days, how she mended fences and shared bread with others who had even less. Doubt nagged at him. But speaking against the merchant's story could cost him his job and maybe his life. The frontier had a way of swallowing men who got in the way of powerful plans. He kept his doubts to himself, though guilt gnawed at him as they rode off to search for another path toward the valley. By late afternoon, the Apache and the girl reached the hidden valley lined with tall pines and cottonwoods. The sound of a small creek welcomed them. Smoke rose in thin lines from several fires where his people had set up their lodges. Children ran between the shelters, their laughter floating up like birdsong. Women worked hides and stirred pots. Men tended horses, sharp eyes always watching the tree line as the pair entered the camp, every head turned. Silence fell quickly under the weight of many eyes. The girl felt their gaze on her pale, tired face and simple clothes. She understood she was an outsider here, just as she had become an outsider in town. Only this place was not built on her customs. She waited for judgment she could not predict. An older woman stepped forward, her hair streaked with gray and braided with beads. Her eyes were keen and measured. She spoke to the warrior in their tongue, sharp and questioning, glancing the girl up and down with no attempt to hide mistrust. The girl did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. The older woman finally turned and spoke directly to her in slow, accented frontier speech. She asked why the girl walked with one of their own and what storm followed her steps. The warrior answered for her at first, explaining how they met, describing the men who hunted her, the guns they carried, the threat they posed not only to the girl, but to the tribe if they crossed into this valley under pretense of justice. The older woman listened, frowning. She said, bringing a stranger here tied their fate to hers. She reminded the warrior that his duty was to protect the people, not invite new danger. More of the tribe gathered around. Some murmured that helping a settler girl might bring soldiers. Others said they could not ignore someone in need. An older man with deep lines around his eyes, clearly a respected leader, stepped through the circle. He looked at the girl for a long moment, then asked to hear her own story in her own words. Her throat tightened. She was tired of telling her tale and never being believed. But something in his steady gaze made her try again. She spoke carefully about the fire, the strongbox, the way the merchant twisted stories. She told them how quickly the town turned, how fear grew into blame, how she left rather than risk the rope. She did not cry. She had shed most of her tears already in lonely nights on the trail. The leader listened and then asked a simple question. If you wished to steal, where would you run? She answered without thinking. She said no thief would run into harsh tribal land with nothing but worn boots and a small bag. A thief would head for the bigger towns along the river, places where he could lose himself in crowds and spend stolen coin. Some of the warriors nodded at that, seeing the sense in it. Yet the older woman still did not soften. She said suffering followed some people like a dark wind. She asked the warrior if he was willing to let that wind blow through their camp for the sake of one promise he had spoken beside a fire. The words stung him, but he did not back down. He answered that if they turned away every stranger in pain, they would no longer be the people they claimed to be. The leader of the tribe finally spoke. He declared that the girl could stay for a time, but only under watch, and only if she obeyed their ways. He warned that if trouble from the settlers reached their lodges because of her, hard choices would have to be made. The camp slowly returned to motion, though many still glanced at her with doubt. In the days that followed, the girl helped where she could. She carried water from the creek, gathered wood, and learned to grind corn beside the older women. Children watched her curiously, then slowly began to smile and ask questions she could not always answer. The warrior taught her to read the land, to understand which tracks meant deer and which meant something more dangerous. Their bond deepened in small, unspoken ways. Yet the promise he made to her, that she would never suffer again if she stayed near him, weighed heavy between them. He knew he could not fully control what storms were gathering outside their valley, far beyond the trees. The riders searched for a path, and they spoke with other settlers, stirring anger. The merchant told anyone who would listen that the tribe had stolen both a girl and a fortune. He hinted that the Apache were growing bold, that they planned to raid the town, that soldiers would be the only answer. Fear took root in hearts already tired from lean seasons and hard winters. The sheriff found himself caught between duty and doubt. He had never liked the merchant's smooth manner. Part of him suspected there were gaps in the man's story, but the town's mood shifted like a herd spooked by thunder. He knew that if soldiers arrived, they might not distinguish one tribal band from another. Blood could run in the dust, and there would be no turning it back. One evening, as the sun burned red behind the jagged hills, the Apache leader gathered his people. Scouts had seen riders moving along the far ridge, drawing closer to the hidden valley each day. Some wore badges, others carried the hard look of hired guns. The tribe debated what to do. Some wanted to pack up and move deeper into the mountains, leaving everything behind once more. Others argued that running again would only invite more pursuit. The girl listened from the edges of the circle, feeling the weight of every word. She knew that, whether she wanted it or not, her presence had become part of this struggle between settlement and tribe, between greed and survival. Later that night, as the camp quieted and the stars spread thick across the sky, she sat by the creek with the warrior. The water murmured over stones carrying fragments of moonlight. He told her that if push came to shove, his first loyalty must be to his people. She understood, but the words still cut. She asked, in a soft voice, whether his promise to protect her still stood, if it meant putting his own family at risk. He did not answer right away. He stared into the dark water as if it held the future. Finally, he said that some paths in this land demanded a price, and none of them were easy. He stood and looked toward the ridge where the riders had been seen. He said he would go out at first light to track them, to learn how many there were and what they planned. He asked her to stay in camp, close to the older woman, and follow every word given to her. She agreed, though unease curled in her chest. As he walked away into the trees, she felt the old fear of being left behind rise again, deep in the night. She woke to the sound of hushed voices outside the lodge where she slept. Through a small opening, she saw the older woman speaking with the tribal leader. They murmured about the warrior's growing attachment to the girl. It's about the danger of letting his heart guide his decisions when conflict with settlers was near. The older woman said that if the riders demanded the girl in exchange for peace, the tribe might not have the strength to refuse. The girl lay still, hardly breathing as those words settled over her like cold snow. For the first time since entering the valley, she understood that she might be asked to walk back into the very hands that hunted her. Not because anyone wanted to hurt her, but because the tribe might have no safer choice. And somewhere out in the dark hills, the man who had promised to keep her from suffering again was tracking armed men, who would gladly use her as a reason to start a war between two worlds. Dawn crept closer, carrying the distant thud of hooves from the far side of the ridge, and the valley waited to see which side of that promise would break first. The first light of morning slid across the valley, turning the creek into a ribbon of pale gold. The girl stood outside the lodge, watching the warrior tie his bowstring and fasten his blade. He moved with silent purpose, every motion practiced. She wanted to ask him not to go, wanted to tell him that facing those riders alone was too great a risk. But she knew the words would only weigh him down. So she simply touched his arm, hoping he understood everything she couldn't say out loud. He gave a small nod, not of farewell, but of promise, then disappeared into the trees with 2 other scouts trailing behind him. The camp felt different after he left. The quiet was heavier, as though the wind itself waited for something to break. Women continued their work, grinding corn and stitching hides, but their eyes kept drifting toward the northern ridge. Warriors moved through the camp with more urgency, checking arrows, whispering plans, preparing for what might come. Children were kept closer than usual, and the older men walked the perimeter of camp. Scanning the horizon again and again, the girl tried to help, but every task felt like moving through thick fog. She carried water, split small logs, and tended the fire. Yet her mind stayed on the warrior moving somewhere through hostile land. The older woman who had doubted her watched closely. She finally approached, handing the girl a woven shawl to cover her shoulders now that the air had cooled. The gesture was small, but it carried meaning. The girl thanked her quietly. The woman nodded, though her eyes still held caution. She said that when danger draws close, even strangers can become necessary. The girl understood. Gratitude and worry tangled together in her chest. Hours passed before a scout returned at full sprint. Breath sharp, face tight with urgency. The council gathered instantly. The girl stayed at the edge, listening. The scout reported that the riders had grown in number. Not 3 or 4 anymore, but closer to a dozen. Some wore coats that marked them as lawmen. Others carried rough expressions that hinted they were hired guns. They had set up camp near the narrow pass that led into the valley. They were waiting, watching, preparing, and among them was the merchant, pacing with restless anger. Pointing toward the valley with wild frustration, the girl felt her knees weaken. If they cut off the pass, the tribe could not travel freely, hunt, or move camp without being tracked or ambushed. The older men debated whether the riders truly intended to attack or simply threaten. The leader stood silent, absorbed in thought. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy. He said that conflict was no longer a possibility. It was approaching like thunder. Whether it came tomorrow or next week depended on small choices made now. The girl stepped forward, feeling the weight of her guilt press like stone. She told them she would leave if it would protect them. Her voice shook, but she meant it. She said she never wanted to bring danger to those who had offered her shelter when she had no one else. The older woman watched her with a softened gaze now, not suspicion but grim respect. The leader considered her offer but shook his head. He said that leaving would not stop what the riders wanted. The merchant needed a reason to seize land, to push the tribe aside, to take the valley for himself. If the girl left, he would simply find another excuse. Her heart sank. She felt trapped between 2 worlds turning against each other. That evening, the warrior returned. He carried dust on his skin and strain in his eyes, yet relief flickered through them when he saw her standing near the fire. The others gathered around him. He reported that the riders were preparing to advance at dawn. They were moving weapons into position, tying their horses higher on the ridge for a faster charge. The merchant had convinced the men that the tribe had hidden the stolen money and that capturing the girl would solve everything. Some men looked uncertain, others hungry for a fight. The lawmen tried to hold authority, but the hired guns carried more influence. The situation could break in any direction. The leader thanked him, then sent word through the camp to prepare for relocation at first light. They would move deeper into the mountains to avoid direct confrontation. But the warrior disagreed. He argued that abandoning the valley without a fight would not stop the riders. It would only signal weakness and invite pursuit. The leader countered that protecting the future meant avoiding battles that could destroy them. Their voices rose, yet both spoke from duty, not anger. The girl watched, torn between fear and admiration. Later, When the camp quieted, she walked with the warrior along the edge of the creek where moonlight rippled across the water. She asked what he truly believed should be done. He answered honestly. He said he wanted to face the riders head-on, not to kill, but to force the truth out before violence could spread. He said that if the merchant's lies took root, not only she, but his entire tribe would suffer in the long run. She told him she wanted to stand beside him, not hide. He turned to her, his expression shadowed with worry. He reminded her that danger would not spare her just because she chose to face it. She looked back at him, steady and determined. She said running had already cost her too much. Standing once, even in fear, might finally break the cycle that had chased her from one life into another. Something shifted in him then. He stepped closer, not with boldness, but with quiet certainty. The promise he made beside the fire echoed in the space between them. She felt warmth rise to her chest, not just hope, but a deep need to believe that the world still held people who could carry promises with honor. By the time dawn bled across the sky, the tribe was ready to move. Horses were saddled, lodges dismantled, supplies packed. But instead of joining them at the rear of the line, the warrior mounted his horse at the front, heading not away from the ridge, but toward it. Several younger warriors followed him. The girl moved to join as well, but the older woman stopped her with a hand on her arm. For a moment, she expected resistance, maybe even a demand that she stay behind. Instead, the woman wrapped the shawl more tightly around her shoulders and told her that if she chose to go, she must speak with courage, not fear. The girl nodded, then mounted a spare horse offered to her. The hooves kicked dirt as they rode toward the ridge where the riders waited. As they climbed, the air sharpened. The sun rose behind them, outlining the warriors against the sky. At the top, they halted. Below, the riders stood ready, guns visible, horses restless. The merchant sat tall on his saddle, a smug grin twisting his face when he spotted her. He shouted accusations, demanding she come down and surrender. He called the tribe thieves and accomplices. He promised the law would protect them if they handed her over. The sheriff rode forward, looking more conflicted than ever. His hand rested on his revolver, not in readiness to shoot, but in weary caution. He asked her to return, saying the town needed answers, that she was making things worse by hiding, before she could respond. A rifleman beside the merchant lifted his weapon, aiming at the warrior beside her. The wind held its breath. The girl pulled her reins tight, heart thundering. She could feel the moment stretching thin, ready to snap. Truth, lies, loyalty, fear, all of it suspended in that fragile space between voices and gunfire. The merchant's grin widened as the rifleman steadied his aim. The warrior stepped forward, unarmed, raising a hand not in challenge but in demand for silence. The girl felt the ground tilt beneath her, knowing that whatever happened next would decide not only her fate, but the fate of the valley. The tribe, and every promise made beneath firelight. The trigger tightened. The hilltop held its breath, and the world stood on the edge of breaking. The rifleman tightened his grip on the trigger. Eyes narrowed on the warrior who stood tall without raising a weapon. The wind tore through the grass on the ridge, carrying dust across the valley floor. Everything felt suspended, held in a single breath that refused to release. The girl felt her lungs ache, her hands trembling around the reins. She knew if that shot broke loose, it would not stop with one life. It would spark something far larger than any of them could control. Just as the rifle jerked forward, the sheriff reached over and shoved the gun barrel down. The shot fired, but the bullet thudded harmlessly into the dirt a few yards ahead. The sound still cracked like thunder rolling across the hills. The horses reared. Warriors tensed, arrows lifting instinctively. The hired guns shouted curses. The merchant spun toward the sheriff, his face twisting with outrage. He demanded to know why he interfered, claiming the man was protecting criminals instead of serving justice. The sheriff's voice shook, but it carried more strength than it had in months. He said, justice meant seeking truth, not spilling blood to cover lies. He told the riders to lower their weapons, reminding them that rifles pointed at peaceful people turned lawmen into outlaws. Some riders lowered their guns. Others hesitated, torn between paid loyalty and uneasy conscience. The merchant rode forward, forcing a path to the front. He pointed at the girl with trembling fury. He shouted that she was guilty of theft, of murder, of destroying the settlement's future. He waved papers with signatures from townsfolk who backed his claims. The girl stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her legs. She told him she never touched any money, never set foot in the office that night, never wished harm to anyone. She said running had been her only chance to stay alive after the merchant turned every whisper into a noose. The sheriff watched her, really watched, and something changed in his eyes. He said he knew she had always been one of the hardest workers in town, and he had never once seen greed in her. He admitted he always wondered how the merchant had been so close to the office during the fire. The merchant snapped back that he had been trying to help, but the sheriff pointed out that someone had used lamp oil, and the merchant was the only one who kept barrels of it behind his store. A murmur spread through the riders. Doubt seeped into faces that once held only anger. The ranch hand who had followed orders out of fear finally spoke, raising his voice for the first time. He said he saw the merchant walking away from the office before flames broke out, carrying something wrapped in a cloth. The merchant shouted that he was lying. But panic cracked through his voice. The warrior stepped forward then, not with aggression, but with calm authority. He demanded the merchant open his saddlebags if he had nothing to hide. The merchant hesitated, and in that hesitation, the truth showed itself. The ranch hand dismounted and tore one of the bags open. Inside were small leather pouches of coin, stamped with markings from across the settlement. It wasn't the full fortune, but it was enough to tie the merchant to the stolen money. The sheriff disarmed him before he could reach for his pistol. Rage collapsed into desperation on the merchant's face. He tried to claim the tribe planted the money, but no one believed him now. Even the hired guns pulled away, shaking their heads as though they finally saw the man for what he was. The sheriff bound his wrists with rope from a saddle, saying he would stand trial for arson, theft, and murder. The girl felt her chest loosen for the first time in months. The weight she had carried day and night finally eased. She turned to the warrior, who met her gaze with something soft and proud. The tribe watched silently from above, waiting to see how this moment would reshape the future. The sheriff faced the warriors and spoke with remorse. He said the settlers had no right to step into tribal land with weapons raised. He promised to speak to the governor to make sure the valley remained theirs unchallenged. The tribal leaders stepped forward, acknowledging his words, but warning that promises carried value only when honored. The sheriff nodded, humbled. With the conflict broken apart and truth set free, the riders turned back to Wardtown. Some looked ashamed, some relieved, and some silent with regret. The girl stood beside the warrior as they watched the dust cloud drift farther and farther away. When the last rider disappeared over the ridge, she finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. The warrior placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. She leaned into the touch, realizing how close she had come to losing everything again. They returned to the valley with the others, walking slowly beneath the tall pines. Children ran to greet the men, tugging at their clothing and asking questions. The older woman approached the girl with a long look, one that carried apology and respect. She placed a braid of woven beads into the girl's hand, symbol of acceptance rather than doubt. That night, the tribe gathered beneath stars that spilled across the sky like silver dust. They shared food and stories, not to celebrate victory in battle, but to honor the peace that had been preserved. The girl sat beside the warrior near the fire, warmth brushing both their faces. He spoke softly, telling her that the world beyond the valley would always carry hardship. But here she did not have to carry it alone. She told him she didn't want to run anymore. She wanted to build something real, something rooted like the tall trees that guarded the valley. He listened, then told her she could stay as long as her heart chose to. He reminded her of his promise in the quiet night when they first met. She reached for his hand, not out of fear this time, but out of trust. The wind drifted through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and river water. The future stretched out before them, not without challenges, but no longer shaped by running or hiding. The settlement would rebuild its truth without her as a scapegoat. The tribe would protect its land with unity instead of secrecy. And she would live not as a lost wanderer, But as someone who found her place beside a man who kept his word, he turned to her in the firelight, his voice low and steady. Repeating the vow that had first changed everything, he told her that as long as she walked by his side, he would do everything in his power to make sure she never carried suffering alone. This time, she believed him. The stars burned brighter. The valley rested. And their new life began in a land wide enough for second chances.